Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I got to talk to Stan Efferding. Stan Efferding has been in the industry for a huge amount of time, and he is someone I've followed for many, many years, and he has always provided heaps of value. From his personal experience and why we think personal experience is super important and the wisdom that brings, we dig into that element, and also the issue with restrictive diets and the issues that those can bring. We also talk about how you can kind of discover charlatans in the industry so you know the people you can kind of trust, and we dig into a bit of his background and history, such as training and eating with Flex Wheeler when he earned his IFBB Pro card. So guys, this is a fantastic episode that I'm sure you're going to get loads of brilliant take-homes from. This podcast is brought to you by MacroFactor, the smartest nutrition app on the market. Think of it like MyFitnessPal, but supercharged. It outperforms it in every single way. You just enter your details and goals, log your food, and wait. From there, MacroFactor fine-tunes your plan automatically, giving your body exactly what it needs to stay on track and reach your goals, without the guesswork. People often complain at how annoying and time-consuming tracking can be. Logging food has never been so effortless with MacroFactor. Due to their verified food database, you can log meals via barcode, search, or even a photo with their smart AI tech. It couldn't be any easier. So ditch the outdated apps and get with the times. Download MacroFactor today and use my code STRONGER to get 2 weeks completely free via the App Store or Google Play, or find it linked in the description below. Now with that said, let's get into today's show. So Stan, I am going to dive and put you right in the deep end immediately by quoting you and asking you to expand upon this. This quote came from just doing a bit of a deep dive into some of your long form content. And the more I listened to you, this quote really just stood out to me as something that just epitomizes the way that you approach, I think, health, fitness, bodybuilding, strength training, everything like that. And it was, I'm not an expert, but I can share my own experiences. So I'd love to hear what that quote kind of means to you, and start there.
Yeah, I've been bodybuilding and powerlifting and coaching, collaborating. Obviously I had college, exercise science, going back almost 35 years now. And I've learned a lot of lessons along the way. And now, most certainly when, I put out my vertical diet book some nearly 10 years ago, we included over 200 references to peer-reviewed published research and articles, and we referred to a lot of domain-specific academically credentialed professionals. And my co-author was a PhD RDN, was director of dietetics at UNLV, and an instructor in the exercise phys department. So, science isn't lost on me. My undergrad degree was science degree, so. And then post-grad, I did exercise science. So it's not lost on me. But, at the end of the day, I really have to talk about things that worked for me and things that didn't work for me based on all of my years of experience, and then reflecting. A lot of it, is looking back. Maybe at the time, some of these decisions that I made, I didn't make, it wasn't for the reasons that I thought. But looking back and then comparing, what my experience was to what the best evidence is, and to what other successful bodybuilders and powerlifters also experience, I think I'm in a pretty good position to tell people what my anecdote is, even though that sits at the bottom of the hierarchy of evidence. My testimonials and my anecdotes, they mean something to me. Doctors refer to it as their clinical experience, and it doesn't carry as much weight as peer-reviewed RCTs and the like. But I think it's more realistic when people can hear from somebody who's tried it, and I can share with them my experience. That's one of the reasons that I think I've had such good success in working with clients, is that I've lived it. I've been there. I've done that. I've done it wrong many times. I don't learn on the first mistake. I have to repeat it numerous times over the years. And then, if you want to talk about specific lessons I learned, that's fine. But just generally speaking, when I make those kinds of statements, I am trying to tell people that I've been there, I've done that, and I talk about things that I know about in that regard.
this is why I think you're a perfect guest for this podcast, because you keep adrift of science and you're aware of like the evidence hierarchy. And this is what I call an evidence-based podcast, but you have heaps of personal experience, which is part of the mix too, because science can't give us all the answers. And I certainly went through this kind of experience where when I first got into bodybuilding is kind of my jam. And when I first got into it, I was just like trusting all the bros, just taking all their kind of a personal anecdote. And then I found science and I was like, it took me a while to let go of kind of clean eating and maybe the bro split and being like, oh, maybe there's more quote unquote optimal ways to do things. But I definitely got caught up in that where it's like, hey, if there wasn't like a PubMed study to say that you should do X or Y, why would I do it? It's like, well, through wisdom, experience of other bodybuilders, they found that this seems to provide really great results, and an absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence in that sense. And I see you as someone who has gone through maybe a similar journey in some senses, but have been so open-minded to change your mind. I know there's things where you maybe had a previous perspective, and I think that's a true trait of someone who's evidence-based, who can change their mind. I think one of them maybe was like seed oils, that is an example, where you had poor experiences with that, but then you didn't put that upon everyone else when you saw the broader evidence and where where that was going. Sorry.
Yeah, those were lessons that I had to learn. I mean, obviously, initially when I came out of the gate, I was pretty anti seed oil, mainly because of its associative data with as the increase in seed oils is also seems to correlate with the increase in obesity, but a lot of things correlate with the increase in obesity over the years. And, most of the seed oils that we consume, 70% plus, were as part of ultra processed foods, particularly the deep fried oils. And we do see some pretty significant research showing that repeatedly reheated oils do have some adverse health effects. And so you're right. I had to kind of provide some nuance to that, uh, and be careful not to demonize certain things. Uh, but it also, as a practical matter, um, there just wasn't anything in the diet that I was recommended that I would replace with something like that. And if you're going to, I have nuts and seeds in the diet, but I don't have seed oils, and I wouldn't take nuts and seeds out and put seed oils in. And I wouldn't take any of the other foods out and replace them with seed oils. It's just not something that I think moves the needle for me or my clients in terms of performance. And I do talk about, and have talked about for many years, almost a decade now, that the fact that some people have adverse reactions to a wide variety of things. As you know, there's, whether it's peanuts, anaphylactic shock, whether it's gluten for those people with celiac, whether it's dairy for some people with allergies, eggs, shellfish. I mean, the list goes on. And that doesn't afford us the opportunity or the right to then paint with a broad brush and say those are good or bad foods as a result. And so I'm cautious. The vertical diet, when I came out with it, intended to be more inclusive. It tended to fight back against the guru diet at the time, which was very popular amongst bodybuilder, figure, physique, bikini in particular. The over restrictive diets that were being prescribed 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. I'm glad to see that there's been a change in the industry in that regard. But those diets were things like egg whites, protein powder, white fish, broccoli, and maybe a teaspoon of almond butter. And just unbelievably restrictive, what I refer to as the guru diet. And I think they were micronutrient deficient. I think that they resulted in a whole host of different problems, as we know, from the female triad, from amenorrhea, cessation of menstrual period, to bone mineral density loss, to hypothyroidism, hair loss, a whole host of the skin and brittle hair drying out because of lack of choline or biotin, and iron deficiency anemia. I mean, those things it's very common amongst women anyhow. And now you take these athletes who are training and then you pull all the red meat out of their diet. They have no iron source. It was just fear mongering a whole host of different foods for really no specific reason. And I think we were setting people up for failure. And behind the scenes, as you and I know, a lot of those people end up needing, some sort of medical intervention to whether it's iron supplementation or thyroid medication or, calcium supplementation, etc. And at the worst cases, even antidepressants was very common amongst people who experience all of those side effects. So I don't know if I veered off too far, but it just it seems like what I was talking about 10 years ago was a departure from what was commonly recommended, and now it seems like that's what everybody's recommending. And so I'm comfortable with that, even though I'm not unique in any regard.
Yeah, I definitely look at the diet, the vertical diet. Well, from my understanding, it's kind of very much has this base at the bottom that's very promoting micronutrient dense foods and a whole host of those foods too. And you mentioned dairy. That's one traditionally bodybuilders remove from their diet, and then completely calcium deficiencies. I think they're kind of rife within that community. And particularly for females, it's not just the micronutrient density that's kind of removed, and so they don't have the variety of foods to provide them health and well-being physiologically, but the kind of psychological impact of having such a restrictive diet, and then cheat meals come into the mix. So you really get this poor relationship with food, and it could just burn a lot of people out, let alone, like you said, some of the longer term physiological consequences, the psychological ones, where they're like, hey, no one should be doing bodybuilding because it's such a restrictive, terrible sport to do. It's like, no, your method maybe was just restrictive and terrible, not the sport itself.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's very challenging. And then, in addition to all the over restriction, then they heap loads and loads and loads of cardio on them at the same time. And that, I think that's counterproductive as well, because obviously it's bodybuilding for a reason, and that applies to physique, bikini, and wellness as well. It's about, growing and maintaining lean mass and displaying that. And those hyper restrictive diets coupled with enormous amounts of cardio, you end up just kind of getting strung out, and you end up being smaller, weaker, less muscular, just looking at the scale. And what's interesting is that, I've been around, obviously, attending bodybuilding shows and listening to, the head of the NPC talk to the women before the show and consistently tell them, look, if losing weight is your only thing that you're trying to do, you're going to do very poorly in this industry. That the only way to change your physique is to add muscle. And she's very clear about that to all of them. And I don't know if it sinks in, or if their coaches bother to listen to those things, but it really is about gaining and maintaining lean muscle mass, off season and throughout the diet for stage display.
Very well said. Yeah, I think it's actually funny. I wonder if it's because it's sort of the easy part in some ways is the fat loss. In some sense, it's much easier for the body to accept. Or the final stages, maybe not so much for a bodybuilder who's trying to get those lines through their glutes, but the bodybuilding process, that long-term adherence to kind of effective practices in your off season, that's the tough part, being consistent there, and that's the eating, as I'm sure you're aware.
It's the long, slow slog. Anybody can take, not anybody, but most people, if they're pretty diligent about it, can take 20, 30, 40 pounds off within 8, 12, 14 weeks. That's no huge feat, other than just being hungry all the time. But adding the muscle takes many, 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 many months or years. And then maintaining that muscle throughout the diet. That's really where I think that what separates, smart, experienced coaches and competitors from those people who just never really succeed in this sport.
That segues brilliantly into another quote I have from you, Stan, and that is, there are no secrets, no shortcuts. It's a marathon or sprint. Consistency, discipline, and hard work is the only way to achieve your goals.
Yeah, that's really the case. And unfortunately, here's what's really interesting. As social media has started to emerge, I saw some 7, 8, 9+ years ago, it was mostly blogging at the time, but then it started to transition into Facebook, and then YouTube, and then Instagram, and now TikTok. I started seeing some of these evidence-based social media personalities. Lane Norton's one that's been around for a long time. In Oregon, another they were blogging before this video social media stuff really existed to any great degree. And they were evidence-based, and they were credentialed, academically credentialed, domain-specific, nutrition, PhD, and they lifted and competed in powerlifting or bodybuilding. We have a whole host of them now. Greg Knuckles, the folks from Barbell Medicine, Austin Baraki, and Jordan Fagenbaum, extraordinary natural powerlifters, deadlifting over 700 pounds at weighing 200, and they're MDs. And so these are people that are just, very smart individuals who have applied all of that information to themselves and to their business, which their business is just, spreading information to people like us who are just so fortunate, because the internet didn't even exist when I was coming up in the 90s. So I'm not too hard on myself for all the mistakes I made, because I was just listening to the guy behind the counter at Gold's Gym. But nowadays we have so much information. Filtering through it becomes kind of the harder part. But I guess to get back to what I was originally discussing, I started to see this trend of people getting called out for bro science, and I didn't want to be that guy. I sort of considered myself a bit of an academic, because I did study exercise science and got a science degree, and have read everything I could possibly read to try and advantage my competitive endeavor and as well as my clients. But these guys were on another level as far as the science went. And when they started calling people out, I was like, oh, this is a big deal. So I actually went back and got my CSCS, and that's when I partnered with Damon McCune, my PhD RDN co-author, just to make sure that I was buttoning up all the potential bro science claims that I was apt to want to make. Unfortunately, even with all these fantastic personalities, now you've got Dr. Ids doing a great job, and Dr. Nagra, and Dr. Pat Davidson. Dr. Stu Phillips has been extraordinary lately from McMaster University. He's been putting out a lot of great information that's just golden. Reviewing, systematic reviews of all the literature on particular topics, and just spoon feeding us stuff that he spent 20, 30 years, studying. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem like those people have the loudest voices, that there's even more. I thought for sure these bro science people were going to get called out. Now the good ones, the smart ones, they evolve. Dr. Peter Attia was dead wrong on a whole host of things over the years. The carbohydrate insulin model, ketogenic diets, intermittent fasting. He's made an extraordinary amount of different claims about those things having some independent effect aside from the actual weight loss. Huberman's another one who made a whole host of different claims about. I think they exaggerate the meaningfulness of a lot of the things that they talked about. But as they started interviewing, the Dr. Andy Galpins and the Elaine Nortons and a whole host of other actual experts in the industry, lipidologists, Tom Dayspring and others, then they started changing. And they started recognizing, oh, well, yeah, maybe it is the weight loss. Maybe it is, just hard work and consistency and discipline. And suddenly the message becomes simpler and simpler. And so, I obviously wasn't distracted by this, but I just noticed that they had this huge followings and people who, just went on these campaigns and just based on, appeal to authority, and presuming that Dr. Peter Attia or Huberman was their appeal at the time. And you watch them, they kind of join these little nutrition cults, as it were. And the next thing, everything's like, got to hang nail keto, it's the cure for everything. And same with intermittent fasting. Oh, autophagy and all these other claims that it had some special magic benefit. For those of us in the know who have looked at the research and listened to the people who are actually, the overwhelming consensus from academically credentialed domain specific professionals is that, independent of weight loss, there's really no special magic thing out there. And I think Lane summed it up pretty well when he said that I always said the best diet is the one you'll follow. And he said that, and he went on and said, the one that feels the least restrictive to you. So I've always had a big tent. I've always said there's many paths to the same destination. There's pros and cons to everything, whether it's calorie restriction or dietary restriction or time restriction. There's pros and cons for different people and different, even in the same study where you see a meaningful difference on average, there's inter-individual variability to where some people will not lose any weight and some people will lose a lot of weight. And so, it's really hard to try and sift through all of this and get through the anecdotes and try and find. It's why I can't. That's why when I still to this day when I get a client, I can't just give them a canned program. I have to send a questionnaire that's very detailed so I can find out, how to customize the I wish I could do that because then I'd make a lot more money with a lot less work. But in fact, I have to touch every single client and look through their questionnaire and write a very specific plan. Some of the stuff's pretty consistent, but everybody's different, and you got to kind of cater to what their personal preferences are, and then try and help them build a program that, as I said in my book, that's simple, sensible, and sustainable, one that becomes part of a lifestyle, because long-term dietary adherence is the key. And the same thing but true with training. Consistency and intensity are still paramount, and there's no hack or shortcut to those things. So I kind of boil it all into compliance is the science, as you know.
Yes, that's so well said there, Stan. So many great points, and many academics you named there have been on the podcast and are people I highly respect as well. And kind of circling it back round to the fact there is no secrets, no shortcuts, and it is a marathon, not a sprint, and you have to work hard. I think that's what a lot of bodybuilders just inherently got right. There was some details about their approach that they didn't get right, but they knew, if I'm dieting and I'm trying to lose fat, I probably need to be a bit hungry. So they kind of lent into that. If I want to build muscle, I probably need to see my numbers in the gym maybe go up and see, kind of hit some PRs over the long term and train hard and feel quite tired. And maybe getting a pump is a good thing because it means I'm training that muscle. And so they didn't necessarily have the most specific and guided approach, and it could be refined through science. But they lent on a lot of things that help. And I think when you get too far into the weeds, you can remove all of your kind of biofeedback and intuitive sense of that hard work and kind of effort and get a bit lost through that process.
Yeah.
Is there anything sorry, go for it.
I was just going to say on that note, one of the things I always loved about bodybuilding and powerlifting was the immediate feedback. Everything to me was measurable and progressible. I couldn't measure, you can feel a pump, but you can't really measure over time progress from a pump, or measure progress over time progress from pain. And fortunately now we have enough evidence to show that metabolic stress or metabolic damage, the pump or pain aren't drivers, they're passengers. I've always tried to beat the book, even back in the early 90s. I've always looked at everything as 1 more rep, 5 more pounds. I set my goals, whether it was the incline barbell press or dumbbell press, my goals were weight and reps. That was always what the goals were. It wasn't just to go in and out of the gym with a pump or wake up the next day sore. That always was just a passenger that seemed to happen when you trained hard. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I love that about this business, is that if you go to the gym and you didn't outperform or at least match your previous workout, something's wrong. And something's happened within the last 72 hours. And so it's so easy to identify that. Whether it was a poor night's sleep or a missed meal, or you were insufficiently hydrated, or you had a real stressful event, or maybe you overtrained and you're just still tired and sore. All of that can easily be identified, first and foremost by recognizing did you do as much weight for as many reps as you did last time? If you did not, there's a problem, and you can pinpoint it. It happened within the last 72 hours. So that's what I loved about it. It seems so simple to me, and still does.
Yeah, people forget that it's the missing the forest for the trees. They see all the sexy new science that maybe comes out, and they forget, well, what's the kind of grounding principles at the bottom of that pyramid that's driving results? And if you aren't logbooking your data, there is no point you thinking about these, like, oh, I don't know, you've probably seen the literature on like length and partials and training at specific ranges of motion. It's like, logbook your data first before you get kind of into the weeds of that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And there may be some juice there, but is it worth the squeeze? I've followed all of that over the years, as you have, and some of it looks pretty interesting. I don't think it's in the top 5 or top 10 most important things that you need to worry about. So I think we've kind of figured out now that consistency and intensity is really where we're at. On the extremes, like when I talk about getting stronger, it might not mean a 1 rep max. That was one of the mistakes that I did make as a young man. I was just going to do a top single. You need sufficient volume, but it all kind of falls in there. I think it's measurable and progressible. There's a difference between exercise and training, and training is measurable and progressible.
Stan, on the note of, you mentioned a lot of smart people previously, and the likes of like Peter Attia and Huberman as being people incredibly intelligent, but maybe have spoken incorrectly about things and then have been corrected. How do you navigate finding the right people to kind of collate great information from versus those to maybe ignore? Is there any kind of red flags you look out for, or green flags you look out for, that allows you to kind of navigate that space well?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of, what I mentioned earlier, domain-specific professionals is important. Now, when Dr. Peter Attia or Dr. Huberman are talking about nutrition, that's not their domain. They don't have an academic background in those fields. And when they bring people on, chiropractors, MDs, who also don't have an academic credentials in that field, it doesn't generally go well. and they make a whole host of claims, and they sit and nod agreeably with each other. But then when they start bringing on folks, if you're going to talk about nutrition, you should be talking to a PhD in nutrition. And my preference is it's a PhD in nutrition who also lifts. That's a pretty important distinction for me. Is that, do these people apply what, in their lives, what we're interested in seeing, or are they just commenting about it? Because I think you have to have some experience. I don't say they have to be an IFBB pro bodybuilder or a world record powerlifter. Not the case. But as mentioned, Jordan and Austin deadlift over 700 pounds, and they weigh 200, 210. That's extraordinary, and they're natural. That's amazing. Alan Flanagan, Dr. Alan Flanagan, PhD nutrition, probably one of the most extraordinary individuals for interpreting literature, looking at the body of evidence and just digging into the methods and the results, and finding what's really meaningful, and comparing it to many other studies to boil that down into some actual recommendations. He lifts weights, deadlifts over 600 pounds for, a guy that's under 200. It's pretty impressive. Greg Nuckols is another one, and Greg's, he's on another level. He's a genius, obviously, and he was a natural. I think set. I don't know if a 3 lift total, but certainly a squat that was at the time a world record that he. But very impressive, and so. In so much as these folks, Eric Trexler, there's the list goes on and on of people who actually compete in bodybuilding or powerlifting and have domain-specific academic credentials. And then I'm just talking nutrition and exercise phys now, and of course, Jordan and Austin are MDs, so that's not necessarily their domain, but they speak mostly about training, and they do have a lot of education experience in that regard. But then when it comes to things like, I mentioned earlier lipidology with Tom Dayspring or William Cromwell, people who are actually spent 30 plus years doing research on lipids and cardiovascular disease. And then you got, contrarians out there, lipid heart hypothesis denialists, such as, Dr. Anthony Shafee, or even worse, Eric Berg, chiropractor, who just don't have any academic experience or research history in lipids. And to me, that's a slam dunk. I mean, there's no comparison. And there's cardiologists, Dr. Allo and, Daniel Biardo. These are MDs that are cardiologists and lipidologists, the Nadolsky brothers. Spencer Nadolsky's a lipidologist. Carl's an endocrinologist, and they do docs who lift, and they lift weights, and they that's their thing. Those are people that to you and I are like, yeah. Those, it seems so obvious to us now that we're able to very quickly sift through, like you say, those red flags. And I have gone down the rabbit hole. Even Lane Norton, as recently as I think 5 years ago, said that saturated fat didn't matter. Examine.com, who has 15 PhDs on their staff, had a blog or a post on their website less than 4 years ago, claiming that saturated fats didn't matter for increasing LDL or cardiovascular disease. So we've all been there, I think. As the literature has evolved, we used to think that drinking a couple glasses of wine every night was healthy. I mean, we swore by it. Doctors prescribed it. And then now over the last 10, 8, 5 years, now that we have Mendelian randomization and some RCTs, no, alcohol at any dose is potentially harmful, and but down the smaller amounts, less harmful than the larger amounts. So I could go on and on about a host of other things, but that's kind of how I measure it. Even with food science, you've got food science babe now instead of food babe. Food babe out screaming and yelling about ret dye 40, and food science babe's like, wait, hold up, wait. We actually have science here to show, And the unfortunate thing is that I go on their posts and I read through their comments, and they have an entire following of people who just nod their heads and clap like seals, and because they have this sounding board of this group of followers who just hook, line, and sinker bought into that kind of stuff. I mean, Liver King had millions of followers. It's just, and I know that these guys are even more frustrated than me because they've committed their entire lives to this research, and then along comes some nitwit that says some stupid stuff like the glucose goddess, and next thing you know, she's got millions of followers and she's selling supplements to cure a problem that doesn't exist. It's frustrating, you can hear it in my voice, and I don't care.
You named so many good things to look out for there. I think the primary ones being domain-specific expertise, but then having experience as well. Because I've certainly seen that where someone could talk the talk, and they maybe wear the lab coat, and they clearly haven't practiced it, because as a practitioner, you see it, you're like, oh, this makes no sense. I've seen completely different and diverging outcomes. And so people talking outside of those expertise. And then people who are maybe a bit dogmatic, trying to sell you on something like a supplement, in their wording, they're maybe a bit black and white. And also if they're counter to a lot of things you've heard, or they talk in quite extremes against other voices in the space as well. I think not that you can rely upon just like go with the sheep and follow, but I think there's something to if like the general consensus is over here and they're all the way over there, it picks up a bit of a red flag, and I'm kind of uncertain if I want to go there. And then also there tends to be people like you mentioned, like an Eric Helms, an Eric Trexler, Greg Nuckols, Lane Norton. They tend to all kind of not again, you could say, hey, we're in a cult and we're all like just kind of shaking everyone's hand, but
Yeah.
I think there's a reason why they come together and they will kind of collaborate with one another, because they're like, hey, you're another respected individual, so on and so forth. But being that way also doesn't lead to the best social media growth. As you mentioned, Liver King, no, as far as I'm aware, no domain specific expertise, and maybe some of the stuff he espoused was semi all right, but like a lot of it was just under like the guise of trying to sell you on something.
Yeah, you hit on something important there. Is that generally speaking, we'll say, get plenty of sleep, eat more whole foods, less ultra processed foods. Uh, that's kind of where it ends, because the next thing I would say is plenty of fruits and vegetables. But now we got people who claim that Anthony Shapey's out there. Vegetables are trying to kill you. I mean, there's people that are that idiotic making claims like that who have huge followings, and then people are like, well, what's the problem? Well, for instance, when Gary Brecka helped Dana White lose weight, and Dana was claiming that fasting had some, reduced cancer by 70%. There's no evidence to that, none. And then people are like, well, what's the harm? He helped Dana, and I'm like, yeah, and that's great, but don't claim that the reason that Dana got healthy was from some obscure thing like wanding your water, or that you had to do 7-day fasts. He lost weight. He reduced his drinking. He lost weight. And we know from the literature that irrespective of diet, 90 to 95% of health benefits are simply the result of the weight loss itself. And that's not to say that, you should eat a shitty diet, but we have seen shitty diets result in improvement in all the biomarkers, whether it's the McDonald's diet or the 7-Eleven diet or the Twinkie diet. And we see blood pressure goes down, blood sugars go down, lipids go down. All those things improve with the weight loss itself. That's not to say that it's, those are the best plans, but they don't have they're not magic by any stretch of the imagination. So we mentioned academic credentials. That's an easy find. Pull them up on Instagram or Google them and find out. Generally, if they're a chiropractor, espousing off about lipids or nutrition in general, you can pretty much scratch them off your list of reliable sources. Even though Eric Berg has an enormous following of people who, all in his comments are, he's the best. I think there's there's a group called redpenreviews.org. I'm not sure if you've seen that group. They have about half a dozen or so PhDs in nutrition that review books that are written by a number of these authors. And unfortunately, some of the more popular books are written by MDs, have the most egregious claims that just don't stack up with the evidence. So what they do is they go through all the references, and they compare the claim to the actual reference that they've posted in the back of their book to support their claim. And they determine as they put a percentage. Redpenreviews.org, and some of the most popular books that are out there, they've gone through and they off the top of my head, I can't remember them. There's too many names and things going on in my head right now, but they do a host of different popular ones that you and I are both familiar with and the audience will be familiar with. And they'll tell you, scientific accuracy, 23%, healthfulness, 42%. And they rank them on about 4 or 5 different percentage scales based on, the quality of their nutrition recommendations, the diet as a whole, and the science as well. So that's another good resource, I think, that people could utilize. Unfortunately, they haven't done as many books as I'd like them to, but they try and hit the most popular ones, the New York Times bestsellers. And what you find, generally speaking, is that the vast majority of those New York Times bestsellers and the ones written by the MDs, not all of them, but the vast majority of them are very poor nutrition books as far as the evidence suggests.
It scares me to think, because I think people will see someone put a reference within, I don't know, to back up a claim, but how often are people then going to look at that reference and read the study to see if it's actually backing up what they said? Because people can chuck any old reference in there.
Or would they even have the experience, whether it's statistical or otherwise, to be able to interpret the study other than reading the abstract. You know, are they able to even read the methods and understand why? And that's why I think it's fortunate there's some really great people doing that now. I think Lane Norton teamed up with, is it Bill Campbell? I'm not sure who he teamed up with, but they do a research review. Alan Aragon does a research review. One of the best, as mentioned earlier, is Alan Flanagan's Alinea Nutrition. He does an extraordinary job of researching, and he covers all the hottest topics, all the latest things that people are talking about. He covers it and has a very detailed write-up on it that is very understandable, while he's, brilliant and can certainly get into the weeds on some of his literature reviews. He summarizes it in such a way that you can be like, oh, okay, I get it.
Yeah, I think the first one I was aware of was the Alan Aragon research review. He was definitely the one that kind of started that. And now you mentioned a bunch there. I think Reps is Lane Norton's. I think he does that with Bill Campbell and some other academics as well. Yep. And then you have the mass research review, like you mentioned, Eric Trexler over there running that with the team. It's just there's a wealth of information. It's just making sure that the right people get hold of it. And unfortunately, I think there are just some individuals in life that, I don't know, maybe someone speaks to something they've experienced and they've incorrectly correlated that outcome with what it is. Like you said, actually, it was the calorie deficit that drove the result, not because you were doing this kind of specific diet, what have you. And then they just like to be a bit counter to the culture. Like there's just people that like to, or someone, you've probably seen this individual, Eddie Abu, I'm sure you're aware of. I kind of feel ashamed because he is British, once a very good bodybuilder, but speaking way out of turn on so many subjects. But people love him because I think he speaks simply and he speaks in a way that it's like, hey, people used to believe the earth was flat because all they could see it was flat. And he kind of speaks in that sense of like, oh, it's obvious, like avoid this because of this. And if you don't think about it much, it's like, yeah, of course, it makes sense. I love this guy.
Yeah. And like a lot of the influencers, they say a lot of things that are good, more whole food, less ultra processed food, exercise regularly, get good sleep. Yeah. Blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's not like we don't agree on that. And, I said many years ago, I was doing a presentation at the Swiss up in Canada. And I said, I don't agree with 100% of what anyone says. And I don't expect you to agree with 100% of what I say. But I said that I've gotten a lot of great information over the years listening to successful individuals. And I take what I can and I put that in my toolbox and I move on and I discard what I don't, think is going to be of value to me. And so I ask folks to be open-minded and to listen. Generally speaking, a lot of the names that I mentioned today, I don't agree with everything that they say. And they don't necessarily agree with everything I say. But I think that most of the things that by the time you get to my stage in life, a crusty old 57-year-old guy who competed for 35 years, and now I'm just curmudgeonly and I whine about stuff on social media. I never wanted to be that guy, to be honest. Turn down that music; it's terrible. But as many of the people I follow, with their level of experience, I think most of what we disagree on isn't that meaningful. And I guess that was my biggest complaint about Huberman, is that people tend to use mechanisms of action or mouse studies to find some, pathway, and then they take these giant logical leaps into outcomes, and I think overemphasize the meaningfulness of their recommendation. And I think the vast majority of the things that are kind of in the weeds just aren't very meaningful. I just don't think they move the needle much. And it only worries me in so much as it becomes a distraction, what I call shiny object syndrome, for people who should be doubling down and focusing on the big rocks. And yet they're running around after, whether it's a supplement or some sort of fancy training protocol that just doesn't have any evidence that it works. I could be specific, but it would probably just further upset people in the comments because I might be shitting on something that they're regularly doing that I just felt that maybe it doesn't hurt them, but what's the downside? Is it potentially taking away from time that could be spent doing something that actually gives them a return on their investment?
So well said. This is why I love talking to people with just heaps of experience, because the more experience I gain, the more I align with those people that just have this heap of experience, wealth of wisdom,
Yeah.
where there's some core fundamentals and then a lot of that nuance where maybe there's small disagreements. People spend far too much time thinking about that, focusing on that.
Yeah.
You ask any person in the gym, they're probably talking about supplements way more than they should. You talk to a bodybuilder thinking way too much about peak week, not thinking about the rest of the process, and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So people easily get lost. Stan, I would be remiss having you on the show, as it's like a bodybuilding show, not to talk about your time. And I'm flipping the script here a little bit with Flex Wheeler, because and there was actually a story I just remembered where you spoke about eating like an entire family bag of Fig Newtons, half a gallon of whole milk, and then you had like 2 days off work. So like it was just like this awful experience, this old like bro science, I guess, of like just massive bulk, like seafood diet. And Flex Wheeler kind of changed some things for you as well. That they kind of co-assigned to some extent. But I'd love to hear your experiences regarding that story.
Yeah. Well, and I dirty bulked back in the early 90s to get up to almost 300 pounds at one point back in 1995. And mind you, in 1985, just 10 years prior, I got to college as a 17-year-old. I was 135 pounds. 1995, I was 300 pounds. It wasn't pretty either. It was a dirty bulk. I had competed in bodybuilding and powerlifting throughout many of those years. First show was in '88, and then subsequent to that, many shows, bodybuilding and powerlifting back and forth. And I was working my way up. My first show, I was 164 pounds, I think. My first 154. It was 154. It was under 160 was the class. And I was 154, my first show in 1988. I won the Mr. Oregon in 1991. I only weighed 199 pounds. So I say only, but that, it's a Mr. Oregon. I just wasn't a huge guy. It took me many, many years, but I did dirty bulk and I got fat. Like you said, your example there, I just looked at the calories. 3 Big Macs was 2,000 calories. So I would have to eat 3 Big Macs to get my 2,000 calories. I was putting extra cheese on those Totino's pizzas at night, and I was drinking whole milk by the gallon every day, the Go Mad diet, gallon of milk a day diet. And I was just far out eating my body's ability to gain muscle, and I was started actually to get fat. I did take some time off of bodybuilding between 1997 and 2006, during which time I was building my businesses and working and traveling some. But when I came back in 2006, I competed. In 2008, I competed, and then I met Flex Wheeler, and he trained me in 2008 and 2009 to go win my pro card. And I was trying to put on weight, but he suggested that I still eat pretty lean, and it's hard to get into a calorie surplus eating clean. I hate to use that word, but without pizza, pasta, pancakes, and those ice cream and that kind of thing. That's not to say I didn't eat some of that when I was powerlifting subsequent to working with Flex, but for bodybuilding, he wanted me to stay relatively lean. But he really wanted me to get my calorie intake up because he didn't want me to. He wanted me to have plenty of calories, so when we started dieting, we got ready for my show some 8 months out. And by that, I mean that the first 4 or 5 months was actually him trying to get what he called, get my metabolism used to eating a lot of more calories. And so we did increase my work volume, which helps on the energy expenditure side, my frequency and volume. But mostly he just wanted me to eat a lower fat diet, a leaner, cleaner diet, which looks a lot like the vertical diet. It was based with a lot of steak, lean steak, top sirloin, 93.7 or 96.4 beef, and then plenty of easy to digest carbs. Rice was a huge component of that. And he just gradually had me try and slowly build up my calories over time. so I could eat more and more food. And then when I came down to train with him the last almost 4 months before the show, I went to San Jose and I lived an extended stay, and I trained with him twice a day, every day, all the way up until the show. We did have to start cutting some calories, but we also increased workload and volume, uh, sets, reps, everything. And we were doing 2-a-day splits, 6 days straight. It was a push-pull legs, 6 on, 1 off. And we were doing splits. So we do quads in the morning, hamstrings at night. We do chest in the morning, shoulders and tries at night. We do back in the morning, bis at night. The workouts never lasted more than an hour, but for the big part in the morning, we do 16 sets, 4 sets of 4 different exercises, way more volume than I recommend now. But of course, I was on performance enhancing drugs. I was eat, sleep, and train was all I did. I lived in a hotel across from the gym. I ate an enormous amount of calories. I didn't do any specific cardio because we were training twice a day. And my history was that I would tend to my legs would tend to thin out if I did a lot of cardio, treadmill, etc. So I wanted to avoid that and try and keep volume in my lower body, which was always hard for me. But I did a video, I think it's called Training Your Metabolism, on YouTube, where I discussed in greater detail how, at first he told me he just wanted me to make sure I was eating my 5 meals a day. I think we may have started with 4. And then at first, the calories that he gave me, I would say, I'm full. And then he'd say, okay, we'll just keep going. Just eat the same amount of calories. And he goes, hit me back when you're hungry again. And so 7, 10, 12 days later, I'd be like, hey, I'm hungry again. He goes, great. Add 2 ounces of steak or 1 ounce of steak to each meal, and add, their quarter cup of rice, spread it out or whatever. And he kept doing that. He didn't call me back when you're full. So I would increase the steak and rice and other stuff too, but just generally just to simplify it, generally increasing total calories. And then I would be full again, but I would still eat the 4 or 5 meals on schedule, and I would be full. And then about 10 days later, all of a sudden I was hungry again. I would eat the food, and then 2 hours later I was hungry again. And I would call him up, and he would say, okay, increase again. So we kept doing this just based on, what's an interesting, and I don't mean to stray too hard here, but something that barbell medicine says often is that you don't add weight to get stronger. You get stronger so you can add weight. So I would say the same thing in terms of calories, that, in terms of lifting, the adaptation has already occurred. That's why you can lift more weight, right? Adding weight, moving a heavier weight slower doesn't mean you were stronger, right? So if you're eating and you're just full and full and full, and you just keep adding calories, you're just going to get fat. But if you eat and then all of a sudden you're hungry again, now it is in my case, obviously my body's utilizing the food, and my metabolism would tend to elevate, is what would happen. And that's one of the adaptations for some people that makes it hard for them to gain weight, is that they either it's through NEAT or their BMI or BMR, whatever it is, or the culmination of any of the energy expenditure sides of the equation. As I started to eat more food, I wouldn't gain weight. After a while, I would stop gaining weight. And explanation to that is that generally your NEAT or your BMR has increased and you're burning more calories. And some people do that in extremes. And I was always one of those people that was just struggled to gain weight, because every time I increased calories, my body would speed up its metabolism. Although we also know that people tend to overestimate on both ends of the scale. Dieters tend to underestimate how many calories they're eating, and bulkers tend to overestimate how many calories they're eating. And if you're good at tracking, that's why we weighed and measured everything. He said, add 1 ounce of meat. He meant add 1 ounce of meat. And I weighed everything and measured everything. It was a half cup of rice. It was 3/4 cup of rice. It was weighed and measured perfectly. And so eventually I got up to, being able to eat an extraordinary amount of calories over the course of that 4+ months that we kept doing this. So when I came down to see him, I wasn't gaining fat, but I was eating a ton of calories. So we had a lot to work with. Now I could start cutting calories. I would lose body fat, but I was still eating over 4,000 calories. When I got there, I think I was eating 5, and then, cutting to 4,500 was a weight loss. But I wasn't hungry. I wasn't eating 1,800 calories. I wasn't tired. I was have sufficient calories to fuel my workouts. And that's what he was telling me about 8 months out. He was like, when you get here, I need you to be consuming enough calories so you can handle the workload. And so we don't have to starve you or restrict you to such a degree that you're going to peter out on me, because the workload was unbelievable. I mean, it was ridiculous, the workload. And I thought it was too much volume. I do now, but it worked. And it was kind of like almost, I talked about excess post-exercise oxygen consumption as though that was a huge thing, 10 years ago. Now we realize it's probably not that big a deal. But some of those leg days, 16 sets on quads, with, we would call them 90-second rests. He would time us. He would time our rest periods. But come on. It turned out to be about 2 minutes by the time I used my delayed stall tactics to try and get my. But I was heaving and breathing, and I mean between sets. At one point, my trachea started collapsing, and I sounded like one of those little dogs, doing that. And Flex would have to calm me down between sets. He'd have to come over and look at me, and he has a big background in martial arts, and so he would look at me, because I would look away, and I would start, you start panicking. You're in deep water. And so he would calm me down. And then just as soon as I said, okay, I'm okay, he'd go, okay, good, you're up. He'd put me back on the leg press, and we'd have to do, this was he was big into the 20s. So we were doing 20 rep sets. And if we couldn't get 20, then he would pull plates, and 20 was the number, whether you could do it with the weight that was on there, whether they had to pull a plate, 2 more, pull a plate, 2 more. I don't necessarily agree with that. I don't prescribe those programs, those routines to everybody. But hey, I was the best I ever was. I can chalk that up to a whole host of different reasons, but it was extraordinary. And I've said this before, I think in my YouTube video where I talked about the real reason Westside Barbell athletes are so strong. I talked about the fact is that when you're training with savages, in a savage gym with a savage coach, you just get more out of you. And I did have a training partner at the time who was just an extraordinary athlete. He was a NFL football player, a Nike sponsored Olympic alternate sprint champion, IFBB pro bodybuilder. And we trained together. He was younger than me. And we trained together, and we competed every single day. We held each other accountable. We even like the depth of the rep, where we're like calling each other out if they were cutting them short, or the time it took us to get back on the set. It's like, you're up. We're yelling at each other because we know that we're trying to hold the other person accountable, but because we're competing against each other, and we didn't want either one of us to cheat or, cutting reps short or whatever. But that was an extraordinary experience. I never worked harder for bodybuilding until I went and trained with Mark Bell for powerlifting. That was certainly pretty extraordinary as well. But one story about Flex I have to say, because he's just a legend, and I used to follow him in the early 90s in the magazines, so to be able to train with him in 2008, 2009 was just extraordinary. But he's one of those guys who, while he's not academically credentialed, they say blind men hear better and deaf people see better. Flex has some extraordinary way of just seeing things. He was born in poverty in Fresno, and academically he didn't excel, but he was extraordinary in martial arts, extraordinary in bodybuilding. It was just, he just saw things, and he would be able to say almost like what I was thinking or what have you. He's just a genius that way as far as it goes with bodybuilding, and he can't articulate it. And people, they routinely slam on him because he doesn't have the scientific vernacular to support what he's talking about. But I tell you, he was spot on. But one time I picked him up. I would pick him up every morning, and I would come to the gym to train. And he would always want to stop by Carl's Jr. and get breakfast. And he'd get those crisp cut fries, and he'd be sitting in the back of the Hummer, and I'd be driving, and he'd open up that bag, and how those things smell. And I'm on a diet, and we're deep into the diet, right? And we're just training our asses off every day. And I'm like, damn it. And Flex just looks up, he goes, boys, do as I say, not as I do. And he sits back
Brilliant.
there, and I can just hear the crunching of those crisp cut fries. I can still smell them now as I talk about it. It was quite an experience. So I can't say enough about it. Yeah, he's just and he's been a great friend, and he lived in Vegas near me, and we trained together many years after that. So I just can't say enough about having a great coach who has experience and who has been there. It means a lot. That's what I purposely did when I wanted to get my pro card. I sought out the best coach I could find, and I was just gobsmacked that he was available. And same thing's true with Mark Bell. When I wanted to set world records in powerlifting, I went to the best powerlifting coach I could find, and I moved into an extended stay across from his gym, and I trained with him every day. And it was those were. And it certainly it was expensive in both regards to have moved somewhere and lived in a hotel and to train with great coaches. And I have a video on that. I think it's called on YouTube called "Why I'm a Hypocrite." Right, talked about the fact that I didn't have a mortgage, I didn't have a wife, I didn't have kids. I had a successful career, and so I had the resources and the time to completely dive. Immerse myself into these experiences, and the return I got on that was I mean, it's all part of history now.
Yeah. Stan, I absolutely love that story. And I think it ties into our discussion so well, where even just to the point where like you did a lot of things with Flex and it produced a great result. But in hindsight, you can look back and be like, I don't know if I necessarily would have done it all that way, but there were things fundamentally in place that maybe were bigger drivers to override what maybe was slightly unoptimal, which I think is awesome. And then also talking about like that, you're clearly like a spendthrift metabolism individual, similar to me. Like my food in my off season just starts ramping up. It makes no sense. I really don't want to have to eat that much, but it ends up happening.
Yeah. And I don't know how the scale doesn't move.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. Your body just kind of absorbs it. You heat up, you start articulating a bit more, and it just burns off you.
Yes.
Yeah. And then almost a bit of, potentially it's related to like energy flux, where you're expending more but able to eat more, and that just led to a better result. I know that's kind of shown in the literature, where if you can be in the same calorie deficit but eating more, that seems to provide better results. And I think in practice and in theory it makes sense. So I love all of that. And then just the environment. I think I used to try and poo-poo that a little bit, where I thought, oh no, I can train in just this commercial gym and get just good results. But then moving to a more competitive environment, one that is more kind of has that bodybuilding culture, and they even see it within scientific studies where they get extreme results, and there's something to that lab of being in there with researchers who train themselves, who are kind of encouraging you and like, you've got to get this rep one more. They seem to get these crazy results.
You've heard the term, if you're the biggest guy in your gym, get a new gym, or if you're the strongest guy in your gym, get a new gym. At one point during COVID, Eric Spoto, I don't know if those in your audience will be familiar, but he was at one time the world record holder in the bench press, 722-pound raw bench press. Extraordinary strength. The guy was just an absolute freak of nature. He was training in my garage with me, and I would always quip that I can't even be the strongest guy in my own garage. But that's the kind of people that I was surrounded with over the years, and I benefited greatly from it. My training partners, I largely credit, even going back to the early 1990 when I was training with IFBB pro Aaron Madron, who was only 18 years old at the time. We were just dumb. We were just toxically masculine and in there just trying to prove to everyone that, torturing ourselves in the gym and limping out of there. And, I talked about that in training, that if you haven't, if your body hasn't seized up in the middle of the night, or if you haven't had to hold on to the railing and take one step at a time, each foot touching every step on the way down and the way up, you don't train hard. And, talking about the difference between Dan Green's one rep in the tank and everybody else's one rep in the tank, it's just night and day. And so I don't necessarily promote people taking themselves to that extreme forever, but I think that at least at some point in your early career, you should try and push yourself. As Dr. Pat Davidson says, that's an adaptation as well. Your ability to tolerate that, and we know that John Perillo used to espouse the Golgi tendon organ training, and I don't necessarily agree with it, but that was one of his things, that you could desensitize the defense mechanisms that your nervous system uses to prevent you from injuring yourself. if you can desensitize those, then maybe you could train harder. And we do give some credence to the fact that motor unit recruitment is kind of dependent on perceived level or perceived exertion or effort. But you might be able to train that such that you no longer perceive what used to shut you down as being hard anymore. And so all of a sudden you can do more. And I just think that's always kind of the gray area that people should travel in.
Yeah, I think it just speaks to why you've been so successful as a bodybuilder, as a powerlifter, and with your business too, as you do push the bounds, you push yourself, you surround yourself by smarter people, stronger people, whatever it might be, and that levels you up tremendously. And it's great to see. And you mentioned a few times, I think it's on your YouTube, Rhino Rants, and I was making my way through those as well in preparation for this, and they're fantastic. There's a gold mine of wisdom there from years and years prior. I loved hearing about your ventures on Shark Tank and everything there. Again, it just speaks to your character and everything you went through. But I've taken enough of your time here, Stan. This has been a fantastic chat, and I hopefully can bring you back on. But thank you so much for taking the time. If people want to learn more
brother.
about...
I'm glad we finally connected. Your audience might not know, and you and I have been going back and forth. You in the UK and me now. Is that where you're at now?
I'm in London.
In London, yeah. And me now, a year ago, I moved from Las Vegas, Nevada here to American Samoa, which is a tiny little island in the South Pacific Sea. Some people are familiar with maybe where Fiji is at, off the coast of New Zealand and Australia. We're even an hour and a half by flight, another 700 miles further out into the South Pacific Ocean. And it's a tiny little island. My wife was born and raised here, and we now have an 11 and 13-year-old that we decided to move here. Thought it would be a great place to raise our kids, and it's an unbelievable community, a beautiful island. It's 4 miles by 20 miles, a tiny little volcanic rock. 40,000 people live on this beautiful little island. It's all coastal, obviously. And we just love it here. I got a little golf cart I drive around on, and I play a lot of pickleball. And they got a couple gyms that are certainly I can get my workouts done. So I just love it here. But I appreciate that we could connect even on our opposite sides of the world, and I hope that your audience got something from it today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I remember thinking, I thought you were in Vegas, and obviously quite a different place to Vegas, actually, you ended up moving to. Although I think of the Strip when I think of Vegas, which isn't how Vegas is as a whole. But that sounds beautiful. If people want to kind of keep up to date with you, I know obviously you mentioned the vertical diet as well. Where should they be heading?
Yeah. Everything's under Stan Efferding. My website's stanefferding.com, and I have my nationwide meal prep company there, and I have my ebook, and I have my online coaching and blood testing through Merrick Health. If people need a blood test in the US, then they can go through there. YouTube, Stan Efferding. Instagram, Stan Efferding. Pretty simple.
Perfect. I'll make sure that's all linked so people can check those out. And again, thank you so much for your time, Stan. Thank you guys for listening. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, brother. Take care.